Hey everyone, our latest Trade to Black podcast, we sit down with the host of CNBC's Fast Money, Tim Seymour, who touched down with us this week in Chicago at the latest Benzinga conference. And he outlines two important things to us. One, will we see change heading into the midterm elections when it comes to regulatory framework? And two, why we should be talking less about this and more about market dynamics. You're going to want to listen to what he has to say in our latest Trade to Black podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to the Trade to Black podcast as we continue our coverage here at Benzinga in Chicago. I'm happy to be joined. He actually runs the CNBS ETF, which is a cannabis ETF. You'll also see him on CNBC. Tim Seymour joins us.
Great to be here, man.
How's things?
First of all, we're driving in a cool rig. I don't care what people want to say about the Jeep, man. This is a sweet Jeep. I don't think I've ever seen a nicer day in Chicago than what we got today. So with all due respect to the Midwest city here.
What do you think of the city?
I like the city, and I need to be careful as a New Yorker of sounding somewhat patronizing about Second City, but no, this is a world-class city. More importantly, the people here are what makes it what it is.
New York, you got the Mets and Yankees.
Got the Mets and Yankees.
White Sox and Cubs. I don't think there's much to brag about in this city this year, right?
Well, look, New Yorkers and the rest of the world loves to see this happen. Certainly the rest of the country. But it's not like New York's been on a good sports run. The Knicks have been probably the worst team in the NBA. At least over the last 20 years. The Mets, as a Met fan, we're a forever suffering franchise that maybe now has a different foundation with Stevie Cohen at the helm. Yankees are always decent, but they actually haven't won anything since 2009. I'm a hockey fan, so I actually
Rangers.
Let's get absolutely.
Not a bad year for your Rangers, that's for sure.
No, we had a good time.
I got to ask you, did you see that Tim Donaghy Netflix documentary
about?
Just about him, the betting on the NBA games, the referee and all that.
I heard about this.
You guys see this. A lot of the stuff was taking place at some of these Knicks games, but wow, it was quite the documentary.
Well, I tell you what, it looks like the Knicks were in cahoots, man. I don't want to say anything, but no, great time, great to be here.
Yeah,
it's this is a really important event for cannabis, and it's fascinating because there used to be a cannabis event at every corner, and they were attracting people, and regionally that kind of makes sense even today because different states, different markets, different regions have different focuses. But I give the guys at Benzinga credit. They put on a great event, and it's become a go-to, and it's great to be here. And
when did you start getting involved with Benzinga?
Probably 2017 or 18. I don't think they were really doing what they were doing in cannabis full time until probably 2018-ish, maybe a little bit earlier. But the earlier events were. Boy, I'm drawing a blank on which events those were, but the key here, and the industry is obviously critically made up of not only just investors and companies, but influencers and legislators and people that I think are possibly even strategics that are massive multinational companies that may be kind of nibbling around the edges. And at an event like this, I feel like a lot of that stuff's been going on.
Have you seen, if you put into a few words as to how much this industry has merged when you start getting involved in Benzinga? Like, you've lived across the world, you like to invest in new emerging industries. We obviously want to manage expectations with where investors are today. Yeah. And I think even from the get-go of this cannabis landscape, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, with the whole Canadian landscape and how people made a lot of money real fast, also lost a lot of money real fast. Do you think that plays into their sentiment when they're investing in today within this cannabis to see what the market potential is here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think cannabis investors are certainly have been shaped by their experience so far.
Right.
And I'm one of these guys, this whole battle between Canada, U.S., first of all, doesn't really exist except for the fact that there has been some perception that the way the Canadian market's federalized and allowed Canadian companies to list in the U.S. And I'm a markets guy, right? Mm-hmm. I talk about markets on CNBC. I've been a hedge fund investor. I ran a long short EM hedge fund for 15 years. Like, markets are what I do. And you gave the context of that. When I started investing in cannabis, I just saw it as another new market for me. I saw it as, hey, some of the dynamics here remind me a lot of what it was like to be investing in Brazil in 2002 and 2003. Because first of all, there's macro is dominating the structural theme. So thematically, you kind of get it. Like in Brazil, you wanted exposure to one of the greatest middle-class demographic stories. People want to own Brazil when it's a country that's rich in resources. It's a very interesting place, but it's also a place that is seen as one of these high-growth new economies. I lived in Moscow for 2 years, and this was back in the late 90s, even before really we had any idea what could be going on today, and it's sad what's going on. But Moscow and Russia, because of their oil, because of their resources, and we're and have been a major emerging economy.
Yeah.
China, because of the demographics and the size of the population. So why is cannabis like emerging markets? Is because some of the investing is you have to believe in some big thematic tailwind on the macro. Why is this happening? Why is there a growing addressable market? Why is there a more interesting middle class that's growing and consuming that I want to invest alongside of? And I think the cool thing about cannabis is it has a few of all of those elements to it. Look, we all are waiting at some point for some headlines in DC to change the environment in which investors and capital markets and companies can operate in this industry, and I think on some level that's great. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this really is a bottom-up consumption story.
Yeah.
This really is a demographic story. This really is, whether you're.
You sometimes pause and look at how much the industry has grown and achieved with all the regulatory framework and the loopholes that they have to jump through, because we get so caught up in this day-to-day language. But when you stop and pause and really look at the challenges that they have to face day to day, I look at it and sometimes I maybe take it for granted as to how much growth this industry has taken place with so many hurdles that they have to jump over.
So there's no question that the companies that are executing now are doing it with one hand tied behind their back, one eye blindfolded, et cetera, and someone stole their wallet. So that is also at least a dynamic that should get investors and people that are tracking the industry. It also should be a reason for encouragement, because these companies are getting better. They've raised their game. Most cannabis companies, at least the major ones, are in management 3.0 at this point, maybe 4.0. And so I look at it as the companies are evolving and they're adapting. If you ask the top 10 multi-state operators in the U.S. what their biggest wish list for DC would be, it's probably just simply solve the tax issue for them. They're not going to say it quite like that, because I think they clearly need to express interest in solving the federal dynamic and the evolution of social justice and criminal justice. But the reality is these companies are surviving and evolving and actually raising their game. And if you took away some of just the free cash flow headwinds that come from this tax bill, that in many cases, especially for the ones that are not either fully vertically integrated in certain parts of their business, that's sucking them dry of cash flow.
Of course.
So it's I don't know, we're kind of all over the map. I just think that the industry, yes, has come a long way. If you'd told me, I started investing in cannabis in 2016, and the concept of federal progress was, look, we were worried about the Cole memo. We were worried about whether actually people are going to get thrown in jail. And in the early days of the Trump administration, no one really knew what the Attorney General was going to do. Obviously, the issues for cannabis really, frankly, one, are not about enforcement, or not about people. That I think it would be great if some of the investors and strategics and people that actually can support and raise this industry even further up the line would get more comfortable with the environment, because frankly, that's that stuff. I think that ship has sailed. I think people having legal issues in the industry are I think that's overdone.
So let's look at where we are today. We're like what, T-minus 60 days to midterms.
Yep.
A lot of conversation that continues to take place, especially the hot topic, safe banking. Whether or not that passes or not, you run an ETF, as you said off the top. What's your strategy when it comes into playing in this industry right now? How are you investing? Are you investing within the space?
Yeah, so CMBS it's an active ETF, and our goal, and just by definition, we have to have because there are ETFs out there that say they're cannabis ETFs that have a lot of tobacco stocks and a lot of pharma stocks, and at times when you couldn't own the U.S. market directly, so owning Cresco Labs or Curaleaf or TrueLeaf was impossible to do in a U.S. traded, without getting wonky, like a 40 Act product. An ETF is a U.S. 1940 Act regulated product, which means that they can't hold swaps, or they got to do certain things. So or you can't hold companies that are doing something federally illegal.
Okay.
So where we got here was in the early days of the cannabis ETFs. The first ETFs in cannabis had a little bit of cannabis exposure in the US, a lot of Canadian exposure because that was a federally legal environment that they could own. So that was Tilray, that was Afria, that was Canopy Growth. And then you'd own a little bit of some REITs, so you don't own a lot of IIPR, you don't own a lot of companies that actually you could own. What's changed, and then so some other companies were filling in the blanks and owning, Scotts Miracle-Gro, I kind of get that story. They were owning Altria, I kind of get that story. And then like, hey, this pharma company might at some point have, some deep dive they might go in. You could own GW Pharma before they were taken out by Jazz. But the point is, having true cannabis exposure in an ETF changed the day that we could own U.S. multi-state and single-state operators on swap. So that meant that as an active portfolio manager and a guy that's invested in emerging economies and asset classes before, I was able to own Curaleaf. Curaleaf's the biggest position in my ETF.
It is.
Okay. And look, to be clear, the top 5 U.S. multi-states are the top 5 positions in my fund. I have a decent sized position in Tilray because I think Tilray 2.0, which is really Afria plus Tilray, has some interesting dynamics that actually.
What interests you when you say?
I think the size of that business in Europe is something that's interesting. I think they at least, along with Curaleaf, have the most optionality to Europe, and I think Germany is at least closer than we think.
Do you have conversations with people in the German market?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, my sense is that from an operator's perspective, those are really the folks that I'm talking to, and those are the folks that are seeing both the evolution of where the legislative process is going, but truly the adoption and what's going on in the medical market, which is highly fragmented and highly profitable for at least the guys that are doing it. But the ability to consolidate and be first mover, I think that's something that's worth having exposure to if you're an investor. And in Tilray's case, like a lot of their Canadian peers, I think more was made about the international opportunity than really was accurate. I think Tilray 1.0.
So what do you, if you define that a little bit more, like when you talk about, like, you've had the conversations, there's a lot of focal point that obviously people here that live in North America focus on the US market. But when we look at that European market to get a true understanding as to how big potentially it could be, what's some of the stuff that you've learned from, like, say, 5 years ago to, like, say where it is now?
Well, first of all, one of the expressions that's critical for cannabis is you've got to be able to eat while you dream. I mean, the timeline here is moving quickly, and I think Germany's going to be the first mover. That what I believe is kind of the posture that's going on in France, and to some extent in Spain and Portugal is following that of Germany. So, country of 80 million people, one of the most sophisticated pharma markets in the world, and an adult market that, at least in terms of its potential, I think, first of all, the affluence, the size of the wallet, the density, and some of the comparison on the consumer to some of the more highly affluent and also the demographics that people want in some of the key markets here are what Germany has. So I just think that the federalization process there is moving a lot faster, and I think let's be clear, there's going to be probably bigger holes in European state, municipal and sovereign budgets that cannabis as an industry can fill. I think there's probably a greater urgency to address that. So, again, I don't think Europe's the answer. I still think this is the biggest market in the world. I still think that
it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking at. And I think, as I look at my portfolio and how to manage a cannabis ETF, my goal is to be investing in the companies that have real businesses today, but the ones that I think actually are positioned for tomorrow. I have to balance this a little bit.
It's not what you've done. It's like where you're going to be pathway within the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we've already started to see some of the separation between the multi-states, some of the bigger ones, and not all of them are, showing margin increase what we've seen over the last 6 months is something that a handful of these guys, and I think Curaleaf is a good example of a company that probably has the ability to grow their margins in the next 6 months because a lot of their CapEx is behind them. As an EM guy, it's no different than investing in a company that, a miner that just bought a new project, dumped a lot of CapEx in it, it killed their margins, and then finally you start to see production come online, or their ability to finally export product, and you start to see this margin escalation. That to me is where I think there are cannabis companies out there like Curaleaf, I think to a certain extent GTI, to a certain extent TrueLeaf, and even Cresco have some of that dynamic working for them if they want to. And I think that's part of the separation. But as a PM, look, we're active. Doesn't mean I'm trading every day. And as a guy who had a background running long short equity, my idea is not to be overly trading this market. And frankly, the liquidity in the cannabis market doesn't allow you to trade that swiftly. But I do think that there's still a lot that as a fund manager and a guy who's talking to these companies all the time, I can add value in the middle of that. And I just think that if you're trying
when you say you're talking to companies and add value, what's part of that conversation? I know.
No. It's fine. It's more of a deep breath as I'm thinking about, the most important issues for these guys are everything from either new markets that they want to get into, the brands that they all claim they're developing, and some of them are more focused on building a brand versus their wholesale presence and where they're actually pushing that versus third-party brands and certain form factors more than others.
Do you find the branding aspect that people are starting to get it right? Because Cookies is a prime example as to it's incredible what Berner's done.
Yep.
But do you find that people are kind of like a footprint as to what he's done, that people are understanding more of the process of branding and taking it to that sort of next level, so to speak?
I do. I think, again, if we were talking about building a classic, consumer packaged good brand, there's a formula around advertising and dollars spent and things that are tough to do in this industry. But that what we also know what creates brands, especially in the spirits world, is sometimes it does come from the buzz around the streets and influencers and whatnot. And so clearly Berner and Cookies have done that. The real question right now is profitability for any brands.
Right.
And I think, Cookies is clearly a leading brand, and whether it's Jungle Boys and then you get into some of the different form factors or Kiva or there are the brands that are emerging. There are the brands that I think actually are known nationally. Look, I live in New York City, and you can get all this stuff in the corner bodega. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's happening. Listening to the companies that, by the way, are developing relationships with third-party brands. And so again, some of the bigger companies, I think the ones that are balancing this house brands versus licensing partners, it's an interesting industry in that you've got a very competitive environment where everybody's kind of working with each other, and they kind of have to work with each other. So.
Absolutely. It's the growth of an industry, right?
Yeah.
We're learning a lot of things. You're a markets guy. So if we look at this, and I'm sure this is a lot of investors' questions right now, if there is no regulatory change come midterms, how do you sort of see this industry unfolding, let's say, over the next 6 months and playing out?
And I don't think there's going to be a regulatory change by midterms. And I think that the good news is everybody knows these numbers. I mean, we've passed in the House 5 or 6 times. We have different conversations going on that I think are probably the more important part of it is there a possibility for some progress between midterms and so lame duck session? Possibly, because.
But far-fetched, you think?
Well, I'm not betting on it.
Okay.
And I don't think investors should be investing based upon looking for a federal headline. As we always say in markets, tell me the headline, and I'm not even sure I can tell you what the markets are going to do. Safe plus, safe with some climax, safe with some there's different components of any of these bills that we've listened to. If you put it into the NDAA, if you put in, there's certain pieces of this that are attachments to larger bills that, yes, this makes sense. There are adults in the room. There are, I think, the right people are having the conversation now for the first time. The posture of Schumer and Booker seems to be a lot more acquiescent and accommodative. But That's not what investors should be investing in. And I think investors...
We've had those conversations today about how people need to kind of reset their expectations, right?
And I think they have. And I think, one thing I'll just, we'll just say, because I think at some point, if you think about where markets are right now in cannabis, you can't invest in a bad neighborhood, and just like you don't want to buy the best house in a bad neighborhood, you probably want to buy the worst house in a great neighborhood. What is the global capital markets and markets environment right now, where outside of cannabis? Look, today, on the day this conference is being held, S&P was down 4.5%, NASDAQ was down 5.5%. There's a re-rating of asset classes everywhere right now. And right now, even though cannabis has, on some level over the last 18 months, probably gone through, I think, done a lot of its heaviest moves lower, I think it's going to be impossible for cannabis markets to rally in the construct of global markets that are hemorrhaging. I just do. And as someone that's been investing in emerging markets, again, EM tends to bottom first. I think cannabis is going through a moment here. I think we have reset expectations on the federal side. I think we've reset expectations on where margins should be. Where should EBITDA margins be? Well, I think we went from expectations of probably 40 to 45% EBITDA margins 9 to 12 months ago. People are now, people are comfortable saying 28 to 30%. That probably makes more sense. So I think it's finding the best operators, finding the companies that are able to operate in a world where capital markets are going to be challenging, and companies that can be somewhat self-sufficient, and companies, though, that have management teams that really are thinking about the future. And investing in an ETF and
the top 5 MSOs are the ones that really grab your attention.
Well, I think for the most part, the reason they're the top 5 MSOs is because they've created some scale. And right now, that scale has never been more important. So interesting times.
Good stuff, to say the least. Big Mets fan, I hear, right?
Big Mets fan. Don't hold that against me.
Year.
We'll take it.
You playing that trumpet tune with Mr. Diaz?
Look, so I mean, Timmy, by the way, Timmy the trumpet. That was one of the great moments in sports history. If you follow this,
isn't that incredible?
This is right. So the theme from Narcos. Our closer has adopted it as his running in from the bullpen song. And by the way, it was one of the great moments I've ever seen in sports the other night. Go back and check this out. Mets Dodgers. One of the biggest games for the Mets in the whole season. They were winning the game. They actually took 2 of 3. Yeah. And this guy Diaz, he's been lights out this year. But
lights out.
But look, I mean, the Trump. What is that trumpet tune called? Do we know? I mean,
my daughter was showing it to me on TikTok because she started playing baseball this year at 8.
Right.
So it's funny because I see a bunch of 8-year-olds. Yeah, it's awesome. It's like a bunch of 8-year-old girls, and they're all running out to this Diaz song. I was just like, this is incredible. So she was the one that actually brought my attention. So needless to say, TikTok is definitely a new platform for younger audiences, but hilarious to say the least. But
well, you got to believe in one of the great Mets slogans from their '69 World Series and their '73 World Series was, you got to believe. This is Tug McGraw. And I think in cannabis, you got to believe. I think you've got to believe in what's going on socially. You've got to believe in the size of this addressable market. Nothing needs to happen to the size of this market right now for your market to double just by changing the illicit market. Easier said than done. But again, we're already talking about a market that I would argue right now, or certainly by 25, is bigger than beer, wine, and spirits combined. And that's something, again, you watch a baseball game. Think about how many ads are beer commercials and spirits commercials and whatnot. So
lounges and bars opening up in West Hollywood as well. It's really like we don't really understand until we actually see it, where this industry is going. But we have an idea, but when we actually live it, we're just going to look back and say, wow, I couldn't believe that this wasn't implemented years in the past, because the conversations that we're having, and like you said, the trending reports of consumption, it's an eye-opener, to say the least.
Well, it's great, and these conversations are cool. I know your audience loves listening to the guys yucking it up in the rig, so good to be running around Chicago with you, dude. I mean, and let's do it. When are you going to get into a yellow cab in New York City? We'll do this run around New York, man. So,
next week, huh?
All right.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching, and if you like this video, wait until you see what we have next. Some of the best thought leaders in the verticals that we cover, from cannabis and psychedelics to cryptos and NFTs and sports wagering. So if you want to learn more, make sure to click on that bell for all notifications, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.